welcome to one of our online lectures here in History Through Film. Today we're going to kick off our unit on warfare, and what we really want to look at is ancient warfare. As we progress through this unit, really what we're going to see is we're actually going to talk a little bit about prehistoric warfare, but we'll talk about ancient warfare, medieval warfare, and modern warfare. And we'll see the progression of tactics, the progression of weapons, and really the introduction of gunpowder and how that changes warfare forever. So, in today's lecture, we only have one learning target we're really going to use to shape what we're going to do here today. The learning target says, what warfare techniques or strategies were used in the ancient world? So naturally, we're going to be able to answer that when we're done with this. Now, you'll see a little note in the bottom left corner, and you also see this on your notes packet. This lecture information will be needed and be needed to be included on your unit assessment that you're going to get here partway through the unit. So this is going to be critical information that you're going to want to have. So what will we learn? What's our path to this learning target today? Like I said, we're going to mention a little bit of prehistoric warfare, so I'm going to give you an overview of prehistoric warfare, but we'll see as we get to ancient warfare, things get much more organized. So that'll be our next focus point. We'll just use the prehistoric warfare piece to introduce warfare, and then we're going to talk a lot about ancient warfare. So we'll start with an overview, then we'll get into the use of chariots. We'll talk about naval warfare in the ancient world. We'll talk about strategies and tactics. We'll look at some weapons that were used, and lastly, we're going to list some of the famous battles. By no means are we going to go into any information on these battles. However, if you find this interesting and you want to look up some of these battles, this is where you would find a lot of these tactics and strategies used. So that's where we're going with all of this today. So let's get started. First of all, you have to make a mention of prehistoric warfare. So the origins of prehistoric warfare really come from a really unorganized type of fighting. You didn't really have infantry. You really didn't have commanders with a different hierarchy. Basically, you armed a bunch of people with weapons and you threw them in battle. The weapons, though, of prehistoric warfare will be very similar to ancient warfare, and one of the things I definitely will talk about here is the different weapons that were used in ancient warfare. In prehistoric warfare, the main thing people fought over was competition for basic resources. That might be access to hunting grounds, it might be the animals themselves, it might be agriculture, it might be a water supply. People didn't really have any political motivation to fight other than just fighting a different tribe because if they didn't get the resources that the other tribe had, they might die. So it was competition for basic resources. It became a raid or starve sort of mentality. We got to take this stuff by force, otherwise we will starve and die. Sometimes you did this due to natural disasters. I mean, there were things that happened with earthquakes and storms and you name it that forced different groups of people to have to shift their need for resources. So they might have to go take from another group of people. And so all this was really done, you want to say, for economic purposes. As more prehistoric people started to advance, there were definitely economic purposes, resources that people would want to protect so that they could continue to trade and benefit from the land. So if you were, able to find gold or able to find a really good piece of land that could produce really good crops, which you could sell, of course you then would want to maintain that, or if somebody else had it, you might want to take it from them. So prehistoric warfare was really more about what the land could offer rather than, like I said, it's not for political reasons, states fighting other states. You didn't really have that happening quite yet. So then that brings us to ancient warfare. Ancient warfare really exists from about 5000 BC or before Common Era to upwards about the 500 CE era, or really with the fall of Rome. And it's definitely much more organized in the prehistoric times. You definitely have a hierarchy going on within your armies. So you have full-time elites, people who were military men for life, who trained and fought and really devoted themselves to warfare. You had military commanders who knew strategy and who fought and were willing to command troops and move them into battle and use their knowledge of warfare to try to outmaneuver the enemy. Certainly, a lot of this comes because of excess food production. With excess food, you have the ability to feed more people. If you have more people, you have the ability to specialize in many different types of warfare, let alone not just warfare, but life in general. You don't have just people who are farmers anymore. Now you have blacksmiths. Now you have different archers and shock troops and all these different types of warriors that you're going to need to really win these battles. So excess food is huge because that ultimately leads to specialization. Now you can have all sorts of different people training in one specific type of trade. So it eventually lends itself to people being archers, those who used bows, those who used spears, like we see here with the types of troops. Like I already mentioned, you have the shock troops, which typically are your troops that carried a spear, maybe a sword, and a shield in the other hand, and they moved into battle kind of head to head on the front lines. Of course, then you could train your archers. You could see a picture of a Greek archer here who would stay behind lines and fire their arrows at a distance. That all comes because of specialization. If you didn't have that excess food, none of this would be possible. So ancient warfare really starts to take on a look of an organized military unit that can move together and fight together. One of the next big things is the chariot. I love this picture. Definitely not the type of chariot you'd see in battle, but it gives you kind of a comical look at the chariot. So the chariots change warfare. So the need for mobility to squash rebellions was really what led to the use of the chariot. The chariot is advantageous for a lot of different reasons. Some of the first chariots were pulled by donkeys and oxen. Eventually, as horses become tamed, horses will pull chariots. The nice thing about chariots is they were, pretty lightweight in terms of their overall weight limit. A chariot could protect you, so it does provide you with some lightweight armor. Some of the best chariots were driven by two men, as you see in this image above. It'd be very difficult, as this picture down below, to not only drive the chariot, but to fire your bow and arrow off the top of the chariot. So you needed two people. You needed one person to drive it, and then you had your archer in the back. Those were the most effective chariots. Most famous chariot battle comes from the Battle of Kadesh, which took place in ancient Egypt. We know that in that particular battle, they used 5,000 chariots. The chariot's advantageous because of its speed, but it's also advantageous because of its vantage point. You're up higher. You can see the battlefield in a little bit different way. It also becomes very, very intimidating when a group of people who don't have chariots come up against a group of people that do have chariots. That can very much influence the intimidation factor. Now, in ancient warfare, you had naval warfare. So the first naval warfare was between the Hittites and people of Cyprus way back in ancient times. But one of the most important advances in naval warfare was the trireme. The trireme was something the Greeks built. You can kind of see it here. It had a battering ram on the front. It had a whole pile of rowers, 3 different tiered levels of rowers, so they could row very, very quickly and plow into the enemy ship, and this battering ram could cause a lot of damage. But here's the deal. Naval warfare could really only happen on calm seas. This was not open to ocean warfare. That did not exist yet. So no ocean, no open ocean battles. It just was a death trap if you went further out the ocean to try to fight. So a couple of different things to mention here with naval warfare. You have the corvus, which you see here. It's almost as like it's a drawbridge that you can lower so that when you pull your ship up to an enemy ship, you could then board it. And you could start attacking with your sword or your shield and spear, kind of in a hand-to-hand sort of combat. So the corvus allowed people to board other ships. I'm going to mention the Quinqueremes here and the harpex in the next couple of slides. The harpex would be something that you could use. You could put this on a ship. as you see down here, and you could basically harpoon other ships to try to steer them off the wrong direction, or maybe sink them, or just to pull them close so you can board them. So in a lot of ways, you would shoot this ballistic device with maybe a hook on the end, and then you could pull your ship alongside of it to make sure that you could board it. So here you can see a modern recreation of it, and this would have been what it looks like in battle. The Quinquereme is essentially the Roman version of the trireme. So you can see very similar. You've got the battering ram here. You've got all the different rowers. They were a little bit bigger, so you could carry more soldiers on it. A little bit different design, but ultimately it's the Roman version of the trireme. So very effective in naval warfare. Tactics. Got a lot of different tactics, and we're going to talk about some of the purposes of this and some of the strategies to go along with it. So your purposes of this, of course, is you want to make money. A lot of times people fought one another to take their resources, to take what they needed in order to profit from it. One of the other things that we see come out of this is the increase in military officer positions. So that is definitely a big advance here in ancient warfare. But another, I would say, probably the most important purpose of ancient warfare from a lot of different perspectives is simply to expand your territory, to take more land. And you usually did that because there was some type of resource there that you wanted to secure. A lot of times those egos, some officers just said, hey, I'm going to take more land because the bigger empire I have, the more powerful I'll look. But in the end, sometimes it was about those resources as well. Of course, the strategy in any tactic that you use, the strategy is to convince the enemy to surrender. And I kind of say, duh, I mean, that's what you want to do. But a lot of people think in warfare, the objective is to kill the enemy. And that's not the case. You want them to surrender. You want them to give up so you can take from them whatever it is you're trying to take. Now, there's many different reasons you may surrender. So certainly total destruction on the battlefield. If you don't surrender, you're going to lose everything. You lose your soldiers, you lose your fort, you lose your weapons. Sometimes if you surrender, you're able to keep some of those things. One of the reasons that people did surrender, they had the threat of siege warfare, which is a very, very difficult warfare. You use siege towers, battering rams. The Mongols were really, really good at this. So you could certainly be putting yourself up for a very difficult fight if you choose not, or if you choose to fight the type of siege warfare the Mongols used. Certainly, if you don't surrender, civilian death toll could be very high. One of the other tactics that enemies use was burning fields, so they might try to burn your food supply if you don't surrender, ultimately forcing you maybe to surrender so you can save your food supply. Another thing that enemies often did was waiting the enemy out. Harvest seasons called troops back. So sometimes troops would be out fighting and they would have to go home because they were soldiers by day, but sometimes they were farmers by trade as well, and they needed to go back and actually collect the food for the rest of the people to eat. Well, sometimes you would have to wait them out. If you waited them out, those soldiers would go home, and now your enemy is depleted, and they have to surrender because they don't have enough soldiers to fight anymore. Sometimes you surrender because you run out of funds, and you have to either pay mercenaries or you just don't have enough money to pay mercenaries. And mercenaries are foreign soldiers. So there's lots of different tactics or different reasons here to surrender. Weapons, got a lot of different weapons here. We have this, obviously you have a spear, you have the atlatl. The atlatl is almost like kind of like a hand thrown spear or arrow, as you can see in this diagram. Javelins were big. Javelins were kind of like big spears that you could throw. You have the battering ram here, the falx. My arrows are not going in order here. Sorry about that. Let me go back. Let's go back. The falx is sort of like a curved spear, which certainly helped you with the aerodynamics of it. Basically just made it a tougher sword. Of course, you would use swords, spears, clubs, slings like you see down here. Pole arms were very similar to spears. Catapults were used in the ancient world. Siege towers, as you saw, and of course the bow and arrow as well. So lots of different weapons that not only lasted in the ancient era, but would certainly make their way into the medieval warfare era. But very few of these are used in modern warfare anymore. With the invention of gunpowder, most of these are rendered useless. Some of them still exist, but if you can bring a gun to a knife fight, you're almost always going to win. The gun just has that much more capability to kill than a knife at close range. Sorry again about the arrows. All right, from the get-go, I mentioned that I would list some famous battles for you, and by no means are we going to look at the information behind these battles, but the reason I'm providing you this information is you may want to look these battles up. There have been movies made about many of these battles, and so this would be a great place for you to do some extra learning if you were interested. So I know in world history, since I teach the course, we definitely look at the first three battles on our list: Thermopylae, Marathon, and Salamis. Those are three battles that take place between the Greeks and the Persians. Certainly very famous examples of battles in the ancient world. Plataea is another one that also takes place between the Greeks and the Persians. Red Cliff is a battle that takes place in China. There has been a film made on that. There's Actium, Adrianople, sack of Rome, and Zama, when the Romans fought the Carthaginians and extended their empire into North Africa. So if you're interested in ancient warfare, certainly look those up. You can look at the Battle of Thermopylae through the film 300, Battle of Salamis through the film 300, Rise of an Empire. It's not like they're great movies, but they certainly show a version of those battles. Red Cliff is literally a movie called Red Cliff. And I'm not sure that there's others made on some of those other ones, but if you like films on those, check those out. So this is going to wrap things up. We're going to do a review of our learning target here. The question says, what warfare techniques or strategies were used in the ancient world? And we've got a lot of good information that we can use to answer this now, certainly with the use of chariots. You saw naval warfare. You looked at all the different weapons that were out there. So you can backtrack through your notes there to answer that question and make sure you have a good understanding of the techniques and strategies used in the ancient world. So that's going to wrap it up here for us today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.